So, let's get going on this video. So this is a video many people have suggested that I watch. It is from EMBER'S Arcade and is called The Problem with YOSHI-P, an Honest Critique. First of all, before I even start watching this, let me just say how bizarre it is for me as a person who's been part of this community since Heavensward to see people openly criticizing YOSHI-P. Back in my day. This was definitely against the law and not allowed. But now it seems like this is something that is allowed for people to do. So let's see. At the same time, you know, any kind of feedback for the devs, I hope is handled in a respectful way. You know, that's you give respect to get respect. So
Zepla
let's see
dancing
how the
blue
video
bun,
goes.
Zepla dancing maracas, Zepla dancing blue bun, Zepla dancing maracas.
Coronai Acorn, thank you very much for the 34-month resub. I do appreciate that. Yeah. Okay.
I think that I've fallen out of love with Final
Can you hear everything, by the way? Before we even get started, the sound's fine.
Fantasy 14. Now,
Is
I know
the sound levels okay, or do we need to change anything? Before we get out of the parking lot with this video. Okay, we're good? Okay, good.
I think that I've fallen out of love with Final Fantasy 14. Now, I know what you're thinking. This is going to be another video essay about how terrible Dawntrail is, right? No, not exactly. Because my moment of realization wasn't in the middle of a cooking competition with Wukla Mod. As a matter of fact, it wasn't even while I was playing Final Fantasy 14. It was while I was playing Final Fantasy 16 that the spell finally broke. I want to make one thing clear. I'm a normal guy. I have a normal job, a budding independent business, a couple of dogs. I don't have a ton of time to play.
How do you fall out of love with FF14 because of FF16?
Video games, let alone make videos for this channel. Thus, in order to independent business, a couple of dogs.
Let me shut up.
I'm a normal guy. I have a normal job, a budding independent business, a couple of dogs. I don't have a ton of time to play video games, let alone make videos for this channel. Thus, in order to avoid wasting my limited time, I don't buy games that I don't scrutinize heavily first. And I certainly don't appreciate when games disrespect what little time I have. Final Fantasy 16 was one of the few games that I've ever purchased on faith alone. Faith that was founded in my experience with Final Fantasy 14, which at the time of 16's release, I would have considered both the best MMORPG on the market and the best narrative in a video game.
I remember playing Shadowbringers, and at one point, I really truly felt with all my heart that this is the best game that has ever been made. And I remember, I think I even tweeted that at the time. This is literally the best game that has ever been created that I've ever seen in my life. Like I know that feeling. I know that's a bold claim, but Shadowbringers was really that good. It was really that good.
14 and 16 are both products of Creative Studio 3, or as
it
it was once called, Creative Business Unit 3, so it shouldn't come as a surprise to any of you that the two games bear more than a few similarities. In fact, they're alarmingly similar in almost every way outside of fidelity, and of course one being an MMORPG and the other being a single-player game. I'll be blunt, Final Fantasy 16 kinda sucked. I acknowledge that the visuals are gorgeous and that the music is wonderful, even if it is just Eureka, and the boss encounters had the budget of a small country's gross domestic product, but the game itself kinda sucked. 16's world was barren, uninteresting to explore, and entirely devoid of danger. The most—
Oh my god. Oh my god. I'm now thinking about this, because I didn't finish FF16, but I played up to the point where you meet the Bahamut guy, and then I think I got distracted, because that's how I am. But I remember feeling like the open world was pretty boring, like FF14's barren open world. And I also remember feeling like the gearing system was really, really boring too. And like very much on rails.
threatening thing awaiting you in 16 is the laundry list of uninspired side quests that offer neither an intrinsic gameplay experience worth having nor an extrinsic reward worth suffering for. Its combat appears intensive, but it masks its shallow systems behind overwrought visuals to keep you from realizing that the enemies you've been fighting haven't swung their weapons in about 6 or 7 seconds. 16 even has the gall to present the player with a crafting system which offers statistical upgrades in order to create the illusion of progression and customization, but the system exists to fulfill a feature quota rather than being something interesting to—
The crafting was just terrible, and the loot was horrible. It was really bad.
interact with.
I
Does
agree.
any of that sound
Like,
familiar to
I
you?
felt like, why even have this
What
system?
other game might that list of flaws also describe? I just can't put my finger on it. If you guys
Crafting
Final
is better in FF14.
Fantasy 14, then congratulations, you've
Let's
been
be
paying
real.
attention, and you've won today's special prize. Please collect a free copy of a good MMO on your way out. In my mind,
Oh,
the
did you just put oh my god, you put the World of Warcraft and you can't do that.
developers of my favorite MMORPG would
Oh my
surely
God.
create a masterpiece with all of the financial backing of Square Enix and a full-length AAA development cycle. Yet the result of that effort was one of the most restrained, lifeless, and quite frankly boring games I've ever played. So, who's at fault? Hence the title. I know, everybody loves YOSHI-P, and you're already upset that I would even suggest that his stewardship of these two Final Fantasy entries has been anything less than stellar, but you have to agree that if there's an issue, then the buck has to stop somewhere, and what better place than with the director? So hold off on disliking the video.
He does
just
have the
yet.
responsibility.
Let me make my case, then you can dislike
Okay.
it. Let's talk about the culture of fear that defines Creative Studio 3's game design philosophy. A few years ago, NoClip released a documentary about Final Fantasy XIV's disastrous launch and its eventual recovery from the brink with the leadership of Naoki Yoshida. You've all seen it. I'd even wager that some of you who are watching this in front of a live audience right now shamelessly re-uploaded it to your channels. It was an inspiring story of determination, unbridled passion, and
You know what? I haven't seen it. Can you believe that? It's true. I never watched it, so that doesn't apply to me. Yeah. Yeah.
this in front of a live
I didn't
audience
watch it.
right now shamelessly re-uploaded it to your channels. It was
Doesn't-
an inspiring story of determination,
Not only did I not re-upload it, I didn't watch it.
unbridled passion, and draconian
I am missing out, though.
micromanagement, which led to
I
the
know.
development of
Okay, I need to shut up so I can listen to what he's saying.
now shamelessly re-uploaded it to your channels.
Okay,
it
I
was
know.
an
It's
inspiring
fine.
story of determination, unbridled passion, and draconian micromanagement, which led to the development of one of the most successful MMORPGs ever made. When I watched it, however, I was struck by one particular scene during Yoshida's interview. I will paraphrase. Basically, YOSHI-P claimed to have implemented a system of task micromanagement which tracked an individual employee's job down to the minute. You can imagine that such a system would be necessary when attempting to rebuild an MMO in 18 months. The results, of course, speak
I do
for
know about
themselves,
that.
but I could never let go of that quote. Why would anyone want to work under those conditions? Well, thank goodness they aren't doing that anymore. But do we know that? Are we sure that YOSHI-P has loosened his grip in the last 10 years that he's helmed Square Enix's flagship live service game? While I would assume that working conditions have changed at the studio, only the people on the inside can say for certain. Either way, I can't shake the feeling that the specter of those grueling 18 months is hanging over Creative Studio 3 to this day, despite all of its success, dictating how they make video games. Consider the way that both 14 and 16 treat their own combat systems. No one would disagree that both of these titles are narrative driven, but there is a sense that Creative Studio 3 is ashamed of the fact that they have to interrupt their storytelling with obligatory combat encounters. 14 is an absurdly easy game in nearly every respect, sequestering its truly difficult content as far away from players as possible in order to ensure that story progression cannot be impeded by gameplay. To experience 14's current Savage tier, one has to play through over 200 hours of story, which is composed almost entirely of stinted cutscenes with sparse gameplay along the way. What gameplay challenges do
Is it 200 hours? I thought it was a lot more than that.
exist are nearly
But first of all, okay, first thing, I seriously doubt that they are tracking people's lives working on the game down to the minute right now. Like, I really doubt that they're doing the exact same type of have the same type of work environment that they did while they were making Realm Reborn, because YOSHI-P has also been pretty vocal about that and looking back on that and what a hellscape it was for them. And so I do not think that it is that bad. However, I do think that it has probably left behind a legacy of wanting to delegate a very specific amount of time for each task to be completed. Now, maybe that time restriction isn't as severe as it might have been when they were developing Realm Reborn, but it is still probably very strict and very, very consistent. Consistency is the goal. That is a reason why what I've started to see as a general problem is the packaging of content that is like has to be packaged in an incredibly specific way. And I think that goes back to them being able to accurately predict how long it will take a department to create that package and reproduce that package over and over again. And so I think this is one of the reasons leading into the formulaic design we see. But as in terms of, you know, a culture of fear gripping people who are working on the game, I don't know if we have enough evidence to support that.
Really impossible to fail, which makes them feel trivial and unrewarding. This is a problem that persists into the level cap. During Endwalker's 6.2 patch cycle, Yoshida himself talked about falling asleep during an expert dungeon.
I remember him saying that. Oh my god. Not only did he say, he actually mimed like falling asleep. He was like, I get sleepy in the expert roulette content. We rarely fall asleep when we play games and we're really into it. I'm trying to see if I can spice it up a little and bring the excitement back. And, you know, looking back on this now, it's interesting. Okay, so how did this pan out for us in Dawntrail? Like, what has been the result of this promise that he made? Well, we've seen harder and more interesting dungeon bosses. And that is... Well, let's hear what he has to say first, and then I'll get into it.
An experience that I've had throughout Dawntrail and Final Fantasy XVI. This is a problem that persists into the level cap. During Endwalker's 6.2 patch cycle, Yoshida himself talked about falling asleep during an expert dungeon, an experience that I've had throughout Dawntrail and Final Fantasy XVI. Despite boasting a combat system built in part by Ryota Suzuki, who led the design of the combat in Devil May Cry 5, 16's gameplay is similarly toothless. The general difficulty is extremely low, with enemies of every variety, from your standard spider in a forest to an S-rank huntmark, offering little to no threat throughout the course of the campaign, which, by the way, must be completed in order to access Final Fantasy mode, which increases the difficulty to a more acceptable level. Again, push the good stuff as far away as possible. Funny enough, you can actually decrease 16's difficulty further by wearing the timely rings, which trivialize combat mechanisms such as using Torgal's abilities or dodging enemy attacks or even performing combos. These accessories are...
Okay, wait a second. So you can't increase the difficulty until you're done with the story? But you can decrease it? Am I understanding this correctly?
Are optional, of course, but they're emblematic of Creative Studio 3's fear that a player will be unable to overcome a gameplay challenge and, as a result, miss the opportunity to experience the next cutscene. Thus, they build their games to be nearly impossible to fail, smoothing out the rough textures that make playing video games interesting, and then they hide any semblance of challenge as far out of view as possible out of fear that you might be scared off.
I think that's really the culture of fear that we're looking at. It is really that. Fear of players being scared off, fear of players being frightened that they are needing to play the game. In terms of the dungeons, and this goes back into this. Okay. The dungeon bosses are harder and more interesting for sure. And that is a W. Like, that is an objectively better result than the dungeons that we had previous. However, the dungeons are still incredibly formulaic, predictable, and the packs of mobs are not interesting. And by the way, people are upset. Like, there are many people that have been vocally upset about the changes to dungeons in Dawntrail, even though, for me, I would say that although the change has been good to bosses, dungeons don't feel fundamentally different in a fundamental way. But there's people who are upset about what has happened. There's people that are upset that they have to apply themselves a little bit more on the bosses. And I actually was reading through Japanese comments on a post a couple days ago, and I found a comment from someone. Actually, you know what? I'll show it to you right now. Person said, Right now, the base content like Dungeons and Trials has become so difficult that people hesitate to even queue for roulettes. So there is a segment of the player base that are now scared to queue for a roulette because there's more expected of them. And they're expected to play the game more in the roulette, when previously they had been using the roulette for, I guess, casual, not like turn your brain off and just exist in it. And I think that this actually goes back to a problem with a lack of real casual content and so everybody gets dumped into the same thing, and so it's impossible to please everyone. But the reason I bring that up is because this is the reason why they have this, culture of fear of how players will react, because they changed it the tiniest bit. They made the tiniest change that doesn't even feel like a real fundamental change that is, I would say, better. And there's people who are losing their minds about it. So what they've done is they've painted themselves into a corner where over time, by making things easier and easier and easier, you start to cultivate a different type of player for the content you're building. And it's very hard to go back from that. It's hard to bring back expectations again if you've already gotten to this point. Because, people are very comfortable and they don't like being shook out of the comfort zone. And again, this also goes back to the lack of the casual content. Because, why isn't there other things in the game that would be appealing to a casual player that would help them not feel like a dungeon boss in Dawntrail is a massive leap that's scary from what they were doing before, right? I don't know. I could talk about that for a long time, but let's try to finish watching the video.
In service of storytelling.
I'm Ruth Lamat, claimant to the throne of Tolihuela.
What I'm about to say applies exclusively to 14. Creative Studio 3 demonstrates more of that paralyzing fear of failure in the delivery of its content
Fear of
offerings.
failure.
Expansions are a strict template upon which an identical experience is built. By refusing to innovate or to introduce new kinds of content or to even reinvent dated systems, Creative Studio 3 successfully evades any possible crisis while also circumventing all potential to provide their paying customers with interesting experiences. Unless they're building a mobile game, of course. In that case, pull out all the stops. The worlds that Creative Studio 3 creates are always beautifully rendered, yet painfully constrained and completely lacking in any sense of danger or discovery. As I began my journey with 16, I immediately recognized the map design as identical to 14's, which gave me some pause because it reminded me specifically of A Realm Reborn. Consider the marshes just south of Martha's Rest. There were moments when traversing the environment and I would see an objective across a river, but because of the restrictive map design, I would be unable to reach it without taking an unnatural detour. It felt completely unintuitive to have to circumnavigate terrain which appeared traversable. Then I remembered that as a hallmark of 14's early world design. One of the first negative impressions I had of Final Fantasy XIV.
That's how it still is. Have you tried getting ether currents on the moon? Good luck jumping across that chasm. You need to walk all the way around.
Was when I realized how segmented Limsa Lominsa
There's the crack in the floor. Oh shit, I can't hop it.
Areas in which A Realm Reborn takes place. The world provides the illusion of a playable space, but the map reveals how small that space truly is. Ultimately, I forgave the game for this flaw, chalking it up to the technical limitations of the PlayStation 3, but when I laid eyes on this, I began to wonder whether or not technical limitations were the culprit after all. What is the reason to continue designing playable environments in this way? And what is the purpose of populating these spaces with enemies that pose absolutely no threat to any player who has the capacity to mash square? Some of the most memorable moments that I've ever had in the entirety of my life playing video games have been a result of emergent gameplay. I recently had an amazing encounter with this while playing Throne and Liberty. I was exploring an environment, then I ran into an unexpected combat encounter which led to an hour-long grind session with total strangers. You'll hear more about that game in my next upload, but those types of experiences in which the player engages with the game's systems and environments to create an unexpected outcome are completely missing in Creative Studio 3's games. This is a result of two design choices.
Yeah.
First, as I mentioned before, the lack of threats in the open world. In both 14 and 16, barring exceptional circumstances, the game is working overtime to ensure that you are never in danger while you are moving towards your next objective in the narrative. In particular, 16 has an issue with allowing the player to severely outscale the creatures in the open world, while also making it impossible for them to dismount or interrupt player movement. So you barely have to consider their existence as you run past them. If the player does decide to engage them, then the enemies usually spend most of the fight standing still, allowing you to ruin them with the same combo that you've performed hundreds of times before. 14 is similar similarly bland in this respect with the exception of S-rank hunt marks, which boast unique and deadly attacks. However, those marks are typically engaged by organized hunt trains, whose sheer numbers completely trivialize the danger of those encounters.
Okay, look, hunt marks cannot be the only thing in the open world that we're doing together to fight. Besides fates. Like, the hunt mark system is old. It's has not been updated upon in all these years. Like, they have not innovated on this or changed it in any way at all this entire time. You literally do not have to think about what you're doing. You just go from one to the next one, and you like, it's not, I would not consider that to be super engaging or interesting open world gameplay. It's like you just go from point A to point B to point C to point D. You know, it's not surprising. It's not exciting. There's no sense of danger in it. That's the reason we have exploration zones and why everybody shouts from the rooftops saying they want Baja, they want Eureka. It's because it's a band-aid for the open world. It takes the place of the open world stuff that's lacking. Why do you think people liked Eureka so much? You know why? A big reason why people like Eureka was because you could die in it if you wander into the wrong area. If you wander off in the wrong spot, you will get murdered fast by giant monsters that are much more powerful than you. And people love that. People loved it. I loved it because I like feeling like danger is one of the things that makes the world feel alive. You know, that's kind of the point we're getting back to. If you can just waltz through it all and sing and dance and skip along through the whole open world and just breathe on things and they die, like what is the purpose of this? You know, is this a walk in the park or is this an adventure in a dangerous world?
And second, the lack of discoverability in the open world. Throughout both games, 14 and 16 boast beautiful worlds which serve as nothing more than set dressing for their respective narratives. There are no hidden treasures behind waterfalls, there are no destroyable barrels with crucial consumables, and there are certainly no secrets to uncover of any kind. Creative Studio 3's world design trains the player to pay as little attention to it as possible, never having to consider his or her options against a dangerous threat, never wondering if there might be something worthwhile to discover off the beaten path. Everything exists in service to the narrative, so as long as the world looks pretty and it stays out of the way of the finely crafted cutscenes, then it's a thumbs up from Yoshi-P. Like I mentioned at the beginning of the video, I'm a busy guy.
Yeah,
One night, following a 12-hour workday, I decided to sit down and play Final Fantasy XVI. I gave myself about an hour of game.
That's why, by the way, that they feel comfortable leaving zones in the state that they left Ultima Thule and the state that they left Living Memory. Is because I feel like it's with the expectation that you're done. We're done with this zone. So, you know, it served the point in the story. And it's okay if it looks like shit now. Or it's okay if there's music that plays in it that doesn't make sense for you exploring in it. Like it with Ultima Thule.
Played before I would get ready for bed. In that hour, I touched my controller twice, maybe? The session was mostly cutscenes, all fantastically performed, but cutscenes nonetheless. I remember putting my controller down and going to bed having done virtually nothing in that session. Then I came back the next night and guess what? The same thing. More cutscenes and almost no gameplay. I began to notice a pattern, which I realized had started as far back as my introduction to Final Fantasy XIV almost 6 years prior. Creative Studio 3 has a terrible habit of stripping away the player's agency in the story that they're so desperate to tell. At every turn in both 14 and 16, control is ripped out of your hands, turning you into a passive observer rather than an active participant in the game. This game design habit has only worsened in 14 with the release of Dawntrail. Attempting to play through the expansion story in 1 or 2 hour intervals like any regular person with a regular schedule was torture. Like off-the-books CIA black site torture.
You know, it's funny. I had all day to play Dawntrail, but I could only play it in 1 to 2 hour bursts as well. So in this case, it's all right if you only had a couple hours to play it, because I had to usually stop after that time and move on to do something else so that I wouldn't become a blasphemy from the
The only
despair I was
conclusion that I can
feeling.
reasonably come to is that no one at Creative Studio 3 plays their own games the way that we play them. Now, I am well aware that YOSHI-P is famously active in Final Fantasy XIV, but what I'm questioning here is whether or not anyone at that studio, particularly its vaunted director, has ever sat down to play through their game's stories in a single, uninterrupted session. If they had, then maybe
Actually, didn't Yoko Taro attempt this, but he quit during Titan? I think he didn't make it through. Yeah, I think he was trying to play through so he could prepare to make the Nier raids. But he fell off. He didn't make it through the great filter.
maybe someone might have noticed how often their games insist on playing themselves for fear of the player's input sullying the experience. These games are not visual novels, at least ostensibly. However, they certainly do function like visual novels, interrupted by brief spurts of well-dressed yet paper-thin gameplay. Under YOSHI-P's leadership, Creative Studio 3 is inviting less participation from players as the years go on. Both 14's recent expansion and 16 go to great lengths to tell you what happened in the story rather than showing you or even allowing you to interact with the events yourself. For example, in Dawntrail, we weren't allowed to participate in the cooking contest or the rebuilding of the train in Shalawani or the invasion of Tuliyola. All of those critical events in the story were cutscenes. 16 is guilty of this too, with the most egregious example being the boat chase towards the end of the game. It would have been a lot of fun to pilot this boat myself, dodging enemy attacks before ramming into
Actually, the cooking contest. Oh my god, I don't want to get into the fucking cooking contest. Okay, let me go back here.
Contest or the rebuilding of the train in Shalawani or the invasion of Tuliyola. All of those critical events in the story were cutscenes. 16 is guilty of this too, with the most egregious example being the boat chase towards the end of the game. It would have been a lot of fun to pilot this boat myself, dodging enemy attacks before ramming into their ship and boarding it. But no, the cutscenes ate up all the budget, so all you get to do is perform the same combo you already have throughout the game against enemies who will barely try to kill you. I really struggle to think of another studio in the AAA space that demonstrates as much disdain for player agency as Creative Studio 3. More than simply committing the sin of ignoring show don't tell as a rule of storytelling, this is a studio which frequently asks its players to stay on the sideline of the experience that they paid for. This is a studio that fancies itself a great producer of stories.
So here's the thing. If you give players more agency, it's going to lead to more unexpected outcomes. It is going to lead to different outcomes that cannot always be predicted super well. And I feel like FF14 makes a priority out of making sure that every single person has the exact same experience that they can predict and that they can account for in terms of time and in terms of the quality every single time with like no deviation or change in between. This is why some people have suggested to me, oh, maybe they had originally intended for Dawntrail to be an expansion where you can choose Kona or Woklamont. And I don't think that idea could have ever gotten off the ground, even if it was there at some point, because they don't like having unpredictability. They are afraid of the unpredictability. Like, in terms of emergent gameplay, what does FF14 really offer? Well, you have housing decoration, I guess. But honestly, a lot of that is made possible through glitches, which isn't even supposed to be possible. You have modding, which is definitely not allowed, and that's emergent gameplay. I feel like something like, for example, Island Sanctuary. Island Sanctuary was marketed as something that would be like a, you know, Stardew Valley-esque type experience. Like, we didn't expect a full Stardew Valley in the game, but we expected some elements of that, which means elements of self-expression and, you know, choose your own things to focus on and all that, like a sandbox. But they just they actually turned like the most sandbox concept game type into an assembly line. They actually did. I don't know why they keep doing this over and over and over, but that seems to be the clear priority. That like we're tired of the assembly line, we're tired of the conveyor belt, Okay, we need people to be able to do some more unexpected things. That's surprising, but this is really scary for them, and I just don't understand why.
But stories can exist outside of the strict parameters laid down by the game developer. That's the beauty of video games. Emergent gameplay is as important to a game's narrative as its writing and its vocal performances. I think that Creative Studio 3 has completely lost sight of that. As an extension of the issues with player agency that plague Final Fantasy XIV and XVI, there's a grand illusion obscuring one of the most unsightly blemishes on the face of Creative Studio 3, the illusion of choice. This is specifically in reference to customization and progression, which are abysmal in both of the titles that have been produced by this studio. Just a few weeks before producing this video, I managed to earn my best in slot gear in Final Fantasy XIV as a Viper. As a result of earning this achievement after months of raiding, I felt absolutely nothing. Similarly, in 16, every time I would forge a stronger weapon or piece of armor or accessory, I would feel absolutely nothing. Creative Studio 3's approach to customization and progression is to simply avoid the topic altogether. Outside of numerical adjustments, improving your equipment in both 14 and 16 is an exercise in boredom. In 16,
oh my god, you know what I just realized? I'm looking back to times that I've gotten BIS, which has been pretty consistent throughout the last couple of expansions. It's true, like, getting BIS was not the exciting part. For me, getting BIS was, at least in times when I was more engaged with the game, it was just a step that was necessary for me to parse. It was about parsing. The parsing was the fun part for me, trying to improve that. And that's emergent gameplay that's not allowed. I feel like a lot of the emergent gameplay FF has is stuff we're definitely not supposed to be doing. We're breaking the game and we're f***ing around with it to give ourselves the infinitely replayable content that the game itself does not offer. Like housing mods, like modding your character's glamour, and like parsing. Okay, like
crafting materials are given to players like government cheese, a paltry handout to keep you moving along the singular track that has been determined for you. In 14, gear is entirely lacking in variety, and the process of selecting your gear is trivialized by the push of a button which determines your best gear for you. Any need for input or weighing of options or opportunity cost has been sanded down or completely discarded. These like progression systems exist as a means to fulfill some kind of design quota. As if someone said, well, we're building a video game, so we need to have a crafting system and gear progression, but we'd much rather add another pointless side quest with 7 minutes of dialogue, so just slap something together and call it a day. For an MMO to have a gearing system this weak is frankly unbelievable. I have never, not once, felt excited about what gear does in 14, only what it looks like. But for a single-player, story-driven role-playing game without the weight of multiplayer balance and technical debt to feel just as bland, just as phoned in, and quite frankly just as boring is equally dumbfounding. Isolated from their other design flaws, Creative Studio 3's inability to create an interesting progression system in over a decade of game development might be excusable, but it goes back to the heart of the issue. Whether or not these are directly his decisions, Creative Studio 3's design philosophy under the leadership of YOSHI-P seems interested only in eroding what little input is left in the hands of the players.
It has felt like that. Like, I remember when, back in my day, FF Boomer memory, when, because of things not being as strictly tied to a 2-minute meta, and because of the ability to mess around with substats like skill speed, like for example, okay, let's just think of an example. Monks used to have a lot of different options for different styles of play that you could create for yourself by building different kinds of sets with different subsets. So you could be like super speedy monk, or you could be, you know, they had all this different variety because that was from player experimentation and coming up with how you can actually alter the job based on the gear set that you put together and, you know, your group and your plans for the encounter. So there's a lot of variety there that was possible. And I think that they didn't want this. That's part of the reason that led us to the 2-minute meta, is wanting to cut down on the variety of experiences players could have depending on their choices. This seems to be something they actively design against. That's the reason we ended up with the 2-minute meta, where everybody has the 2-minute damage buff, you know, and it stopped being like this kind of wonky, jank, all over the place buffs that you could sort out with your raid team and tailor to an encounter. That was something that raiders found very enjoyable in the past, but it must have been difficult for them to balance around. I don't know. I feel like they just wanted to make sure, again, it goes back to what I was saying earlier, they want everyone to have the same consistent experience no matter who you are, and they want to try to guarantee that as much as possible to the detriment of your player agency. And in terms of the progression systems that he was talking about here, you know, why it hasn't the progression system for gear gotten interesting in all this time? Why is it still basically exactly the same? Now, we did have new gear added to this chaotic alliance raid. You know, you got to give credit where credit's due. But I mean, I'm someone that I've moved into the okay, I moved into being more of a casual player. I don't want to raid. If I wanted to raid, I'd already have Biss from doing the Savage gear. So you're asking me to do the same thing again. Like, the Chaotic Alliance raid is still just a hard boss in a room. Like, that's... I want something different. We need to suit with the different kinds of content that are available. You want to try to suit different kinds of players, so you have different paths to power. That's something that World of Warcraft does well, and it's the reason why World of Warcraft gearing tends to be pretty interesting, because you have the choice between, like, you can do Mythic plus Dungeon, and you can choose which plus you want depending on how hard you want to sweat. You have time walking dungeons, you have raids, you have delves now that they've added. Another way that you can, maybe the other things you don't like those, maybe you want to do it by yourself, you want to be solo, you can do that now. Raids have 4 different difficulty settings depending on what you're comfortable with. You know, there's world quests, there's reputation rewards where you can get power. There's the seasonal events. There's open world treasures. There's open world bosses. There's the, like, open world events like we had time rifts. We got now Siren Isle. We got, you know, I remember things like Furak assaults happening. Okay, they're constantly asking themselves, what are different ways that we can give a player freedom of choice to choose their path to progression today based on how they're feeling, based on their time investment, and based on their sweat level. Like, how sweaty are they? Okay. But FF14 just doesn't have the variety of content that it needs to suit all these different people. And we're going to end up in a situation where nobody's happy. Okay, it's already starting to occur with dungeons, where they made the dungeon bosses a little harder, and casuals are upset because they feel it's too much pressure on them. In the roulette, they're scared to queue for a roulette, like super casuals, which I've read this comment to you earlier. Then you've got people who are mid-core who are still not really satisfied with the dungeon because it hasn't gone far enough to make it more interesting. And then you've got hardcore people who, you know, the dungeon is so far beneath their skill level that it's not totally irrelevant. Like, they think this is supposed to be a hard dungeon boss. Like, you know, so what are we doing? We're in a, no, you're going to end up trying. There's a case where not taking risks is a risk. That is where we're headed, or where we're already at.
Final point of contention that I want to talk about is Creative Studio 3's quest design, or lack thereof. In the MMORPG genre, quests are a bit of a conundrum because they typically boil down to talking to an NPC, clicking on an interactable item, or killing a group of enemies, but that isn't necessary by its nature. When we talk about quest design in MMOs, we treat it as though it's a solved problem, as if that's the extent of what the genre is capable of, but quests can be more than the linear processes that we become accustomed to. Creative Studio 3 demonstrated a willingness to push the boundaries of these dated assumptions about quest design during Endwalker. They gave us a sort of Metal Gear Solid mission and a timed puzzle to contend with, which proved to me that the idea of the quest can still be a platform for innovation. What happened to that, Studio?
What happened?
Unfortunately, 16 and Dawntrail were a regression in this regard, resting on the laurels of the most basic form of quest design that you can think of. Go over there, deliver this thing to that guy, kill this bug. Yes, the fate of the world is at stake, but I really need you to help me pick these herbs. Creative Studio 3's game...
It's funny you show the Peluzzo there, because I think that trading up the whole trading crap. I think that was supposed to be like exciting and different quest. I actually think so, because it's like trade offer. I'll give you this and you'll give me the next thing. But it was just oh god. There was a lot wrong with it that I'm not even gonna get into right now.
Lean
I don't
heavily
feel like it.
on the dialogue as the experience of their quests, rather than the given task of the quest. This is an assumption, but it seems to me that the developers are confident that the intrinsic value of their quest design is more than enough for their players. The gameplay experience or the prize at the other end of the quest are an afterthought. In some cases, they're right. The story has the capacity to be more than enough. When I think of the most memorable moments during Shadowbringers, for example, I don't think of gameplay experiences. Rather, I think of the laundry list of incredible story beats that line that expansion story from start to finish. In that particular case, the intrinsic value covered the cost of admission. But when the story isn't as strong, then the gameplay better be damned good, or at least have the wherewithal to give me something I care about for sitting through the boring dialogue. But the reality is, that's an impossible thing to ask for. YOSHI-P's vision for Creative Studio 3 requires that their games are completely devoid of tension, threat, or input by the player.
So what you're describing now with the quest design is a problem that we have always had, with a few small exceptions. And in this sense, you should thank Dawntrail. Everybody here who didn't like it, you should thank Dawntrail, because it's finally letting the community be vocal about stuff that has been swept under the rug for years and years. Finally, you can see clearly that without a fantastic story that's distracting you, you can see that maybe these quests could be improved as well. Now, of course, yeah, the responsibility for that, though, should still rest upon YOSHI-P's shoulders. Like, we shouldn't have to wait for the veil to be lifted to see flaws. Okay, that's kind of their job. They're supposed to ask themselves, have we innovated enough with these old systems? Is this still really fun and engaging to do? And I kind of agree that it's hard for me to imagine that that YOSHI-P actually played through all of it. I just can't imagine this. But he must have. He checked it. He shipped it. He approved it. He must have played it. He must have played it. Like, I just don't know. I don't know what's going on. But even the best gameplay moments are rooted in story. For example, the Olympus dungeon, where you have to fight your companions, or the Body Snatcher quest, where you are desperate to save your friends. Yes, exactly. Like, instead of us settling for, oh, if only the story had been better, then everything would be okay, maybe now we can reach for, not only can we expect a fabulous story, but we can also expect incredible gameplay that backs that up and adds to the magic of those moments too. Like, you don't have to only have, like, we can expect more because the game is capable of so much.
Out of fear that their game's true reward, which is the next cutscene, will go unseen. To that end, their worlds must be built as set dressing for the story rather than spaces in which emergent gameplay can take place. Traditional progression systems threaten the delicate balance of their game, so they must be reduced to linear statistical advantages, lest they overwhelm the player with having to make a choice. And because the player cannot be reliably trusted to participate in a theatrical scene exactly as the developers envisioned it, they're forced to wrest control away from the player over and over again to ensure that the gameplay doesn't get in the way of the narrative, which, as you know, is the most important part of a video game. I understand that for many of you, YOSHI-P is something of a primal. People become incredibly emotional when you have anything negative to say about the products that he stewards, but remember, Naoki Yoshida works for a company. He's at the helm of an organization which creates products which you pay for. Some of you have given thousands of dollars to Square Enix for continued access to Final Fantasy XIV. It's my opinion that for the money you've spent, you deserve better, although whether or not you agree with that is up to you. YOSHI-P and the hundreds of faceless employees who work at Creative Studio 3 are not your friends. You have a transactional relationship with that studio's publisher and the games they produce. If you're happy With the slop that you've been served by Creative Studio 3 since the release of 16 and Dawntrail, then all power to you. For those of you who are a bit more sympathetic to my critiques, do as I've done. Vote with your wallet.
I understand this is a hard pill for people to swallow, that it is a transactional relationship that you have with the dev team and with the game. If you're like me and you've spent many years feeling very sentimentally attached to the game, and you know, I've talked to YOSHI-P, I've had an interview with him, I've met him, and like, this has been a journey that we've been on together. Like, I do think that he cares about FFXIV, but I just think that I think something is clearly wrong, and I don't know what it is, frankly. Like, are they just not playing it? Are they not asking themselves the right questions? Are they just too afraid of changing anything too much for the player? Maybe a little bit of all of these things. I don't know. But I want the game to succeed, and I want to see the old YOSHI-P back. Like, frankly, with Dawntrail, all his statements that he's made in response to the player feedback, this is the first time that I really felt that he was actually out of touch, where he just would not acknowledge the overwhelming feedback he was actually receiving. And so this is really the first time that I felt really concerned about where things are going. Like, I started to feel a little concerned in Endwalker patches. And that's when I was really vocal about it back then. But the fact that he won't acknowledge what's happened and is just saying stuff that's irrelevant to what players are trying to tell him, this is really where I start to worry the most. Like, of course, we're all going to wait the long game. Well, not all of us. I will wait the long game, and I'll wait and see if things can improve. But I need to hear some assurances from them and some acknowledgement of the failures that have gone on. And without that, it becomes increasingly more difficult to put faith in the team, because this is a break of trust. What has he said? Oh. I can find it. Okay. One sec. Well, let me finish watching the video first, because this might take me a minute to track it down. But I did talk about it at length already. Oh, wait. Is that
well,
it?
everybody, that is the end of that scathing essay. I'm looking forward to the public's reception of it, but if you'll give me about a minute, I have a few unscripted words that I want to say. This channel actually began as a Final Fantasy XIV channel, and it began because I was so bored during Endwalker's post-expansion patches, and I wanted something to do with the game, so I figured a few top 10 lists and maybe a few essay pieces couldn't hurt. 14 has been such a massive disappointment, particularly in the last 2 years, that I just can't see myself making more dedicated content about the game. I would love to have a reason to come back and write more essays about 14, but I just don't think that's going to happen. There are plenty of other games out there to explore and other things to write essays about, of course, so please stick around if you love MMOs as much as I do and you'd like to hear me talk about, say, Throne and Liberty, which is coming up next. Either way, as we approach the end of the year, I just want to say thanks to everybody for being here. I know it's only a few thousand of you, but I really appreciate it. It's a lot bigger than I thought it would be at this stage. If I don't upload again before the end of the year, then have a great Christmas, Happy New Year.
Well,
God bless you all.
I'm glad to see people being vocal about their criticisms and concerns, because I think that's the only way that things are going to improve in any way. Like I said at the start of the video, it is absolutely wild to see it happening when like, there was a time when this would not go over well at all. But it seems that the reception of this video has been fairly positive, and that makes me sad. Because I came to Final Fantasy XIV from World of Warcraft. And one of the reasons that I came from World of Warcraft was because I felt that the devs were out of touch, that they weren't listening, that they weren't trying to make enough, like, I felt like there wasn't enough to do. I felt isolated in the game, and I just felt like, you know, at any time I heard the devs talk, it was alienating to me. And I felt like they were not listening. They weren't even playing their own game. And it's heartbreaking that I feel like I've entered this territory with Final Fantasy XIV now. I don't want that to happen because, like, I know how good the game can be, and I still feel really sentimental about it. Of course I do. I want to, but I felt sentimental about World of Warcraft this whole time as well. The entire time you've seen me on YouTube or on Twitch, in any time across all these years when WoW was really in the shitter. What did you hear me say? Same things. You heard me say, that's a game that I really loved. That's a game that meant a lot to me. And that's a game that I really hope will succeed again. I'm just waiting for that day to come. And I waited. And the day has come. That's why I'm literally streaming World of Warcraft today. Because it's better. They actually had their come to Jesus moment. They started listening to the players, and I have a ton of interesting things to do. And other games will evolve. There is this competition in this space where, you know, our time on this planet is limited, and other games are competing for your time. And it's just heartbreaking to me that I feel like how the turn's tabled, you know. FF14 is a good MMO, but it needs a lot of improvement. Completely agree. Thank you, Todd. That's it. We love the game and give a shit about its future. That's it. That's the part that people don't. I hope people can finally see, if you care about something, then you're going to cheer it on and you're going to point out flaws, because that's the best thing that a player can do for the dev. But it's scary for them. They put themselves in a pretty tough spot. With 8.0. YOSHI-P has promised a total overhaul, like a class redesign that's going to be amazing. Classes will be fixed in 8.0. Okay. And they've also put a shitload of pressure on themselves to make a phenomenal story now. Because they are really in a pickle at this moment. Because at this point, okay, 8.0 is coming in what, late 2026? And I seriously doubt anything super crazy is going to happen before then. Maybe we'll get a decent exploration zone. But right before 8.0 releases. But if 8.0 isn't an absolute banger, then I think that will be the last chance for people. Of the last hangers on, because a lot of people that I know did not return for Dawntrail because they wait to see what the reception is first before they buy the game. And I know people that fell off in Endwalker patches and did not return, and I cannot for the life of me convince them to come back. I can't. And so yep. As a content creator, we have a vested interest in its success. That is very true. That is obviously very true. Yeah. Zepla, the biggest challenge is seeing that they're already done some of the things we want more of, as you noted, a lot in terms of the storytelling in your review. It's like, we know you can do this, but why not now? What do you mean by they've already done some of the things we want more of? Like, specifically. The first person who got me into FF14 actually quit Dawntrail in the first half. Oof. Yeah. In 2025, we shouldn't have separate clunky DCs for a region. It should be seamless. Yeah, that's another thing with being able to just easily play with people no matter where they're at. Did you get a chance to look at the latest Lucky Boncho census numbers? No, I don't think I did. How recent was it? Maybe. Yep. Sorry if the video was depressing, but I'm glad it resonated with players. Well, I appreciate you sharing your opinions on this because we need more people being vocal about it. Or because I wish it didn't have to be this way. Okay? Like, I wish they would just proactively make changes the game needs instead of us having to cry and hoop and holler about it for 10 years, you know? But I just feel like they tend to get complacent about things and they just figure, well, players are over. They've always dealt with it like this, so they always will probably. Like, fundamental things have to change with the core systems. Can't fix PS3 netcode. Check the Reddit post. It's crazy, the comments. Well, let me look at the comments here first. I don't know if it was... Okay. FFXIV video or another game, but what I heard was something like, if the selling point of the game doesn't sell, the existing flaws become more visible. That is something I said in Endwalker. That's what I was trying to tell y'all in Endwalker, was that the cracks are starting to show. But the cracks were starting to show earlier on than even that. You know, the way that this has worked is, and the way it usually will work, is the first people who notice problems are going to be the people who are the most invested and the most in touch with the core game systems all the time. So the high-end raiders, usually, like the people who play all day, every day, these are the people who are going to notice the problems first. And then it just kind of trickles down from there. Then more mid-core people start to notice problems. And then casual people start to notice problems. And that's kind of where we've ended up. I love YOSHI-P. This is from Drac. This is a long comment. It says, I love YOSHI-P, but that doesn't mean constructive criticism is never valid. Your points are critical, but they're constructive. They have purpose. It's not blind hate. If I didn't have my... Yeah, I felt like it wasn't a disrespectful video, which is something I was worried about. I'm relieved to see I did not seem disrespectful, but it seemed like we're holding you accountable for the product that you're creating for us, the consumer, which is appropriate. Now, like for us, ideally, the best case scenario is we don't have to do that because they're proactively making great changes, so we can all just, you know, sing YOSHI-P's praises till the cows come home. You know, that's what I prefer doing. But at a certain, you can't ignore things either. If I didn't have my friends to raid with, FF14 probably wouldn't have my sub as it is now. Well, I'm not raiding. Stopping raiding was a big eye-opener for me and how little there is to do outside of that. And I think that if I hadn't stopped raiding, I would have probably been more positive about Chaotic Alliance raid. But I don't want more of that same thing that we already have. Like, it's a 24-man body check versus an 8-man body check. Okay. Is that really wildly different? I mean, it's harder. So I feel like it's going in the other direction than what we need. The thing, we have the hard content. The thing that stood out to me lately is the latest Beast Tribe / Society questline where you have to deliver something from point A to point B. But there may be 1 or 2 monsters on the way, making it trivial. Oh my god. Are you talking about fighting 2 fish and a crocodile? Like I've been on and on about? With a Pelupel. It was... The Beast Tribe quest is really bad. Straight up. Like, I'm just gonna be blunt about that. I think it's quite bad. I think it's bad so far in terms, I haven't finished it. Maybe everything's gonna change. But so far it's been rough, and I'm doing it because I want that manatee really bad. Compare that to 2.0 Sylph Transport or Stealth Quests, and it's such a stark contrast. I mean, yes, carrying the garlic for the sylphs was definitely more engaging. However, some of those quests were also super annoying. Like, I remember waiting around for that pig to show up for God knows how long in the Sylphlands, and we couldn't fly back
Exiled
then.
Linearian says leave YOSHI-P alone.
Okay. Jayhorn, thank you for the 35-month resub. I do appreciate that. Yeah. Not that Beast Tribes were ever really hard, but you at least had to pay attention. Beast Tribe quests should not be hard, but hard is not required for fun to occur. Like, you... so the things can be fun, but not hard. I think that is a possible thing. With 16, my biggest gripe was how linear things were. No risks, no diversity of playstyle, aside from which icon you decided to use. Even then, combat can't compare to the DMC levels of combos, but most of all, the legendary weapon you get at the end is just there. Nothing out of the way to find, no challenge attached to it. You just kind of get it. I understand them wanting to cast a huge net to keep as many players as possible, which I worry has created a culture of players that only want to log in, collect rewards in the easiest way possible, and log off. Endwalker Relic quests were a joke. Not sure why they use an MMO for that when idle games exist. Well, this is what I was talking about when I was watching the video, about how I worry they painted themselves into that corner of players expecting a certain level of face roll in the content that they do, and will throw a fit once they're expected to do slightly more, like it's already happening with Dawntrail dungeons. Because you're trying to cater to different kinds of players with the same content. But you've already been dumbing down that content so much over the years that the players that are still engaging with it are not like, you've already alienated the people that wanted it to be a little bit more hard. Like, they have a problem now. They have a problem with the lack of content, lack of variety of content. I think a lot of backlash will happen if Square Enix tries to correct course. It'd be worth it in my opinion, but it depends on what the corporate heads say, which is the only area I'd slightly push back. YOSHI-P is at the helm of this, but I wonder how much pressure is kept on him to keep the game as simple as possible. Because 14 is the game keeping Square Enix afloat right now. Pressure. He's the one, like, he's in charge. It's his call, ultimately. And he has to be able to resist pressure. He has to be the one exerting pressure. I guess that they think taking risks means risking the financial well-being of the company. Pure speculation, though. I don't know. Because not taking risks is the biggest risk they're taking right now. That's the part that they don't get. As a closing thought, I've been playing PoE 2 here and there, and oh my goodness, it's hard. The first awakening or whatever quest line, where you have to make it through a gauntlet of challenging rooms with no healing, took me several tries. It was so refreshing. I got to unlock something and feel like I earned it. I have to properly avoid enemies or get wrecked. I have to use my abilities with proper timing and spacing, or I get swarmed. It has power fantasy moments which feel good. You also get punished hard if you let your guard down. I mean, properly avoiding enemies and using your abilities when it's appropriate are things that you can apply to content that isn't crazy difficult, but that's some of the ways you can make it more fun. That's something that I found fun in playing World of Warcraft. Like, finding some small little abilities that I can do that's different depending on what class I play. Maybe not even anything crazy. Just small, tiny examples, right? Like, using my tar trap on a hunter to slow down a pack of mobs, using my swirly, like vortex thing as a druid to keep things away while I fight them. You know, silences being relevant and having to kite at times, pull as many mobs as I can in an area and try to kite them around. It's fun for me. I found little ways like that to have fun. FFXIV can only do that now in the raids, which I've been banging this expansion the rest of the game though. A shadow of what was, unfortunately. Okay. What YouTube video is this? Let me give you a link to it here in the chat. This is The Problem with YOSHI-P from EMBER'S Arcade. Many people had been suggesting that I watch it, and I'm glad I did. It was pretty solid and enjoyable critique that was indeed honest sounding.